Evelyn Grayson wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary on this gray, rainy day. She sat at her kitchen table, watching raindrops slide down the window pane. Her suburban Pennsylvania home had long been a quiet refuge, but sometimes it felt far too empty. It had been 3 years since her husband Richard had passed, leaving a gaping void in her life. They had no children, and over time, friends had drifted away, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. That's why the letter that arrived that morning was such a surprise. It was strange, an envelope made of heavy, textured paper, sealed with red wax, as if it held secrets from the past. Evelyn turned it over in her hands before carefully opening it. Inside was an official document. Glossy paper, a law firm's letterhead, and neatly typed lines stood out in stark contrast to her modest surroundings. As she read, her heart began to beat faster. "Dear Mrs. Grayson, we regret to inform you of the passing of your aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Sinclair. Per her final will and testament, you have been named the sole heir to her estate, which includes a house and land located in rural Maine. We strongly advise you to visit the property in order to complete the necessary legal formalities. Please be advised, the house is in need of upkeep and may require repairs. Additionally, we urge you to heed the following warning. Be careful with the silence. Sincerely, Danvers and Partners Law Firm." "Aunt Elizabeth?" Evelyn whispered. The name felt distant, like something from another life. She had only ever heard of her aunt in passing from her mother, who rarely spoke about her family. Elizabeth had been an odd, eccentric woman who had left home at a young age and had little to no contact with relatives. Evelyn carefully folded the letter and glanced back out the window. Memories of a long-ago conversation with her mother surfaced in her mind. Elizabeth was always different, her mother had said. She preferred solitude. She was strange. No one really understood her. There had been an unreadable expression on her mother's face, as if she were trying to forget something unpleasant. But why had Elizabeth chosen her, Evelyn, as her heir? The question gnawed at her. The next morning, Evelyn woke early, before dawn. She had spent a restless night, tossing and turning, replaying the strange letter over and over in her mind. Part of her wanted to ignore the inheritance entirely, to leave this mystery in the past. But another part, one that longed for change, for something new, insisted this was an opportunity. Or at the very least, a chance to break free from the monotony of her life. Pouring herself a strong cup of coffee, Evelyn sat at the table and started making a plan. The trip to Maine would take a full day. She needed to prepare for the house inspection and, if necessary, an extended stay to handle legal matters. She gathered important documents, packed a few changes of clothes, and grabbed a flashlight, just in case an old house required it. The only thing that truly unsettled her was the warning. Be careful with the silence. What could that possibly mean? Was it just an eccentric addition to the will, or was there something more to it? The drive to Maine was long and exhausting. By evening, Evelyn found herself deep in dense forest land. The road had narrowed considerably, and the trees stood so close together, their branches nearly formed a tunnel overhead. There were no street lights, no signs pointing the way. Her GPS, which had already lost signal multiple times, finally gave out completely. By the time she reached the gates of the house, night had fallen. A rusted iron archway, its paint peeling, was nearly hidden by overgrown vines. A weathered plaque on the gate read Sinclair Manor. Beyond the entrance, only darkness loomed. Evelyn pulled up, parked, and stepped out of the car, peering into the shadows. A cool night breeze wrapped around her, carrying the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the distant cry of an owl. She pushed the gate open, its hinges groaning in protest. As she stepped inside, she froze. The house before her looked as if it had been torn from another era. A towering 3-story structure, its roof sagging, its windows cracked, its wooden siding battered by time. Yet even in its decay, it exuded a strange, haunting grandeur. Evelyn pulled out her flashlight and made her way up the porch steps. The boards creaked under her weight, and to her surprise, the front door was slightly ajar. Her heartbeat quickened. She switched on the flashlight and stepped inside. The house greeted her with the musty scent of old wood and dampness. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as though untouched for decades. In the dim glow of her flashlight, she made out antique furniture draped in white sheets and wallpaper peeling from the walls. A heavy silence filled the space, a silence so dense it felt like the house itself was watching her. Evelyn moved toward the living room. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a collection of old photographs stood in tarnished frames. She picked one up. It was a portrait of a middle-aged woman with piercing, unreadable eyes. Elizabeth. The resemblance was clear, but there was something unsettling about her gaze. Then, in the silence, a faint sound echoed, soft, like footsteps brushing against the floor upstairs. Evelyn froze. Her grip tightened on the flashlight. She listened, holding her breath. Nothing. Probably just the wind, she told herself, trying to shake off the unease. But deep down, she knew this house wasn't just old and abandoned. There was something else here. Exhaustion won out in the end, and Evelyn decided to sleep in her car. But as she turned to leave the house, her eyes fell on a small bundle of papers resting on a table near the entryway. A journal. The name Elizabeth Sinclair was written in black ink across the cover. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. On the first page, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "This house has a life of its own. Be careful with the silence." Evelyn snapped the journal shut and hurried outside. One thing was now clear. This place held more than just her family's past, and the answers she sought might be far more terrifying than she ever imagined. Evelyn stood on the porch, clutching Elizabeth's journal. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but she barely noticed. The pages in her hands whispered stories of the house, secrets she couldn't yet decipher. Despite her exhaustion, an unsettling mix of fear and curiosity crept over her. By early morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense forest, Evelyn knew she had to go back inside. She couldn't just leave things as they were. This was her inheritance, her connection to a family she barely knew, but one phrase from the journal kept looping in her mind. This house has a life of its own. Beware the silence. Stepping inside, she realized just how massive the house was. At night, it had felt ominous and unwelcoming, but in the daylight, it was simply abandoned. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her feet, as if protesting the years of neglect. Damp stains marred the walls, and the faded wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing cracked plaster beneath. But the strangest thing was the sound. The house seemed to breathe, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh that moved from room to room. She climbed the staircase to the second floor, journal in hand, her heart tightening with each new passage she read. One entry caught her eye. The walls whisper at night. They remember more than we can ever understand. Evelyn hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring down the hallway lined with closed doors. Each door felt like a mystery, holding a piece of the house's past. She opened one and stepped inside. It was a bedroom, most likely Elizabeth's. A worn wooden rocking chair sat by the window, and an old quilt lay across the bed, its colors faded with time. On the wall hung an oval portrait of a young woman, Elizabeth in her youth. Her gaze, almost too lifelike, seemed to follow Evelyn's every movement. On the nightstand beside the bed, a battered book lay open with a page dog-eared. Evelyn picked it up and read the underlined words. They come at night. First, they whisper. Then they call. Don't answer, no matter how much they beg. Descending to the first floor, Evelyn explored more of the house. A door at the far end of the hallway led to the kitchen. It was surprisingly large, with an imposing cast-iron stove that dominated an entire wall. Dust coated the wooden table in the center, and on it sat a small wooden box. It was closed but not locked. Lifting the lid, Evelyn found a set of old keys. One of them had a small tag attached, marked basement. Her stomach clenched. The basement. That word alone sent a chill through her. Even as a child, she had feared the dark, and basements always seemed like the embodiment of that fear. Still, she knew she had to see what was down there. She found the door to the basement behind the kitchen. The lock groaned as she turned the key, and when she pulled the door open, the damp, stale air hit her immediately. The wooden staircase looked fragile, and each step groaned under her weight. It was pitch black below, but her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing cold stone walls. Scattered across the floor were remnants of old crates and sacks covered in cobwebs. But something in the center of the basement caught her eye, a round table with an unusual object resting on it. a metal disc etched with strange symbols. Evelyn stepped closer. The markings were unfamiliar, but their arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Beside the disc lay a note, written in the same handwriting as the journal. "Don't touch it if you want to remain whole." She didn't touch it. Instead, she turned and hurried back upstairs, her breath coming faster. This house wasn't just old, it was hiding something she wasn't sure she was ready to uncover. Outside, the day was fading into evening. Evelyn decided to spend the night in one of the upstairs bedrooms. She brushed off the dust from an old bed, spread out a blanket she brought with her, and tried to settle in. But as the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive. The floorboards creaked as though under unseen footsteps, and soft sounds echoed down the hallway. She could swear she heard someone walking past her door, but she didn't dare check. The beam of her flashlight flickered. In the silence, a whisper emerged. At first it was faint, barely audible, but then it grew clearer. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was insistent. Then she heard it. "Evelyn." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the flashlight as if it were a lifeline, holding her breath as the whispering continued. By morning, the house was quiet again. But Evelyn knew it wouldn't let her go so easily. She had to find out what lay hidden within these walls, and why her aunt had left this place to her. The journal, the disc, the whispers, this was only the beginning. By the third day in the house, Evelyn could no longer ignore its strangeness. Just when she thought she was getting used to the creaking floorboards and the faint rustling sounds, something new would happen, like the house was deliberately testing her patience. But instead of letting fear take over, she made a decision. She had to understand what was happening here. She knew the answers were hidden somewhere, within Elizabeth's journal and within the house itself. That morning, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered notes and the open journal. The pages, filled with Elizabeth's cramped handwriting, held stories that made her skin crawl. Several entries mentioned people who had lived in the house before Elizabeth. Some were just tenants, others the actual owners. All of them had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Jonathan Smith, the caretaker, vanished in 1935. The last thing he said was, "I can hear them calling me." They found his body a week later, out in the woods, but no one could explain how he got there, considering the snow was untouched. Evelyn shuddered. She reached for her coffee, but her hand trembled so badly that the cup nearly slipped from her fingers. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes. There was no use pretending it was all just stories. Something about this house was undeniably wrong. The next entry spoke of Clara, a young maid who worked here during World War II. Elizabeth described how Clara had complained about shadows following her through the house. One day she simply vanished. The last note in her own personal journal read, "They watch from behind the doors. I've locked all the windows, but I know it won't help. I'm scared." Evelyn flipped the page. Her gaze landed on strange symbols drawn in the margins, symbols eerily similar to the ones etched into the metal disc she had found in the basement. The feeling that all of this was connected was growing stronger. By evening, the last of the sunlight faded from the windows. Evelyn decided to explore more of the house, checking rooms she hadn't yet entered. At the far end of the second-floor hallway, she found an old locked cabinet. It groaned in protest as she forced it open. Inside, she discovered several drawers filled with yellowed newspapers. One of the headlines caught her eye. "Missing boy found dead. Mysterious disappearance at the Sinclair house." Evelyn's heart pounded as she scanned the article. It was about a teenage boy who had come here with his parents in the early 1950s. His mother told the police he had started talking to someone at night, someone no one else could see. A week later, he disappeared. His body was later found in the well behind the house. The newspaper stated the cause of death was drowning, but no one knew how he had ended up there. Evelyn set the paper back down, her pulse quickening. This house wasn't just an inheritance, it was something much darker. Something dangerous. That night the whispers returned. Louder this time, closer. Evelyn sat in her room, clutching the journal to her chest, trying not to move. It felt as if any sudden motion would draw unwanted attention. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. Evelyn took a shaky breath and forced herself to stand. The dim glow of her flashlight cast long shadows as she crept toward the door. Slowly, carefully, she cracked it open and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged, like something unseen was watching her. She took a step, then another. She made her way toward the staircase. Downstairs, embers still smoldered in the fireplace, even though she was certain she hadn't lit a fire. Standing near the hearth was a figure. A woman with long, loose hair. Evelyn froze, a chill spreading down her spine. The woman turned, and Evelyn realized with horror that she was looking at Elizabeth. But that was impossible. Her eyes, lifeless, empty, stared straight through her. Slowly, Elizabeth raised her hand and pointed at the journal in Evelyn's grasp. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. She turned and hurried back to her room, her nerves on edge. One thing was certain: if she wanted to uncover the house's secrets, she would have to face its darkness head-on. At dawn, she sat back down with the journal. On one of the last pages, she found an entry she hadn't noticed before. Elizabeth had written, "Anyone who crosses this threshold becomes part of the house. Stories don't end here, they simply turn into whispers." Evelyn could no longer deny that the house had a life of its own. Her days were filled with whispers, the echo of footsteps, and the feeling of constant surveillance. The nights, however, had become a true test. The silence that Aunt Elizabeth had so emphasized in her letter had turned into a trap, filled with sounds that couldn't be explained. But tonight promised to be the creepiest of all. After a quick and humble dinner, Evelyn locked all the doors and windows, checking the bolts twice. But even that didn't bring her any comfort. Her instincts screamed that she was not alone in the house. As darkness fell, she stayed in the kitchen, the only place where she felt even a little bit of safety. The fireplace crackled, but its light couldn't dispel the darkness that had filled every corner. "Who's there?" She asked aloud when she suddenly heard a sound like a faint knock. Silence was her only answer, but the sound came again, this time closer. It sounded like something scratching against wood. Evelyn stood up, gripping the flashlight like it was a sword. She followed the sound, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The noise led her to the stairs. She raised the flashlight and saw scratches on the wall. Fresh ones. Before she could process it, the light on the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness surrounded her. Then she heard a whisper. It wasn't just one voice, but several. They came from different parts of the house, as if someone were walking toward her from every direction. "You shouldn't have come here." Evelyn hurried back to the kitchen and locked the door behind her. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, blending into a horrifying chorus, and then came a loud bang, sharp and forceful, like someone had shoved the door. Evelyn screamed and grabbed the kitchen knife that had been sitting on the table. "Get a grip," she mentally told herself. She knew running would be useless. The house wouldn't let her go. After some time, everything went quiet. Evelyn cautiously opened the door and peeked outside. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick and suffocating. She took a step forward, then another, until she noticed a strange glow at the end of the corridor. It was a faint, flickering light coming from a room that she thought was empty. She moved closer, and the light grew brighter. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in horror. On the floor was a circle of candles, and in the center, an old doll with a face that looked scorched, as if burned by fire. The walls of the room were etched with names, carved by a sharp object. One of them caught her eye: Evelyn Grayson. At that moment, she felt someone standing behind her. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't dare turn around, but she heard the whisper filling the room again. "You belong to us." Evelyn spun around quickly, but no one was there. Her legs felt like they were glued to the floor, but she forced herself to move. She bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The whispers stayed behind, but the sense of dread didn't leave her. Later that night, when she tried to sleep, something disturbed her again. The door to her bedroom started to creak open slowly. Outside was darkness, but she felt like someone was standing out there. Evelyn got out of bed and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the hallway. No one. She approached the door and suddenly felt a cold hand brush her shoulder. She turned, but the room was empty. Unable to take it anymore, she ran downstairs, heading for the exit. She grabbed her phone, but the screen was dead. No signal. She tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge, as though it was locked from the inside. In a panic, she ran back into the living room, where she noticed the bookshelf, which had once seemed so ordinary. Now, behind it, there was a gap leading to some hidden room. Summoning all her courage, Evelyn stepped closer. She struggled to move the bookshelf, revealing a passage. The room was small, with bare brick walls. In the center was a table, covered with photos, letters, and a journal. Evelyn recognized the faces. These were the people Aunt Elizabeth had written about. The missing ones. Among them was her own picture. On the back of the photo, it read, "She's next." Evelyn screamed and dropped the photo, spinning around. A figure stood before her, tall, dark, with blurred outlines as though made of mist. Its eyes glowed like embers, and it reached out to her. She felt the fear seize her body. But in that moment, she remembered her husband's words. "Don't let fear control you. You're stronger than you think." Evelyn shut her eyes, took a deep breath, and, gripping the knife, lunged at the figure. But instead of impact, she felt emptiness. And silence once again enveloped the house. That night didn't bring her answers, only more questions. Evelyn knew one thing for sure: the house wasn't going to let her go. And perhaps her only chance to survive was to find the source of the darkness that held this place in its grip. Evelyn woke to the sound of a distant knock. Her heart raced, as if it knew trouble was coming. Her eyes fell on the clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, the witching hour, as the town legends called it. She pulled on her robe and slowly got out of bed, feeling the cold seep into her skin. There was an odd tension in the air, like the house was holding its breath. She remembered the events from the night before. Shadows, whispers, photographs. The house seemed to be playing with her, testing her limits, but tonight felt different, darker, more sinister. Evelyn knew the climax was near, and she had to be ready to face whatever was lurking in the darkness. The living room was dimly lit. The fireplace she had left burning was now out. The light from her lantern flickered on the walls, revealing scratches she hadn't noticed before. They looked like words, but they were too mangled to read. Evelyn heard a voice, deep, resonant, with a rasp to it. It sounded both distant and right next to her ear. "You are our debt. You are part of this place." She flinched, gripping the lantern tighter. The voice seemed to come from the room where she'd found the circle of candles. She moved toward it, carefully stepping on the creaky floorboards. Each step echoed in her ears, and it felt like the house was watching her every move. When she entered the room, her breath caught in her throat. The candles were burning again, even though she was certain she'd put them out. In the center of the circle was a small wooden box, and fresh carvings were etched into the walls. They were names. Among them, she saw hers again. But now, next to her name was something new. Today's date. A cold sweat dripped down Evelyn's spine. She couldn't afford to stop now. She moved to the box and slowly opened it. Inside was Aunt Elizabeth's journal, but this time the pages were handwritten. On the first page it read, "Last words for my niece." The journal revealed everything. Elizabeth described in detail how the house had been built on land where dark rituals were once performed. The family that owned the house had sacrificed themselves to bind the pain to this place and gain immortality. But instead of eternal life, they became ghosts, trapped between worlds. The house fed on the suffering of its inhabitants, and each new victim only made it stronger. "I tried to leave, but the house won't let go. You are the last in our line, Evelyn. If you're reading this, the house has chosen you, but you can finish what I couldn't." On the last page was a drawing, something like a map, a knot of intersecting lines. Below, Elizabeth added, "Find this in the basement. Break the link." Evelyn felt her hair stand on end. The basement was the only place in the house she hadn't been. She had always avoided it, feeling that something awful was hidden down there. But now, she had no choice. If she wanted to survive, she had to go down there. The descent into the basement felt like a journey straight into hell. The stairs creaked, and the air grew heavier with each step. Evelyn switched on the lantern, and its light revealed rows of old, dusty shelves. In the corner, she saw a massive wooden door, reinforced with metal strips. She didn't remember ever seeing it before. As she moved closer, the door started vibrating, as if something was trying to break free on the other side. For a moment it seemed like she heard Elizabeth's voice. "Be strong." Evelyn steadied herself and pushed the door open. Inside, she found a room that resembled an altar. The walls were covered in symbols, and in the center of the room stood a large stone with the same knot from the journal carved into it. Evelyn realized that this was the source of the evil. At that moment, the house came alive. The walls trembled, and screams and cries echoed through the air. The darkness thickened, and figures began to appear before Evelyn. They were the spirits trapped in the house. They surrounded her, their faces twisted in pain and fury. "You can't destroy us. You're one of us," a voice boomed, filling her mind. Evelyn remembered her husband's words, "Don't let fear control you." She grabbed the knife and struck the stone with all her might. For a moment, everything went still, and then there was a deafening sound, as if the house screamed in pain. The stone cracked, and dark energy poured out, engulfing everything around her. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The house began to crumble, and the spirits disappeared one by one. She felt it. She was finally free. By dawn, Evelyn stood by the ashes of what had once been the house. Her body ached, but her soul was free. She knew she would never forget this horror, but she also knew that she had finally broken the chain of pain that had bound her family to this place. This was her legacy, and she had conquered it. Evelyn turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. Now, she could begin her life anew. The day promised to be clear, but the morning over the ruins was foggy and oppressive. Evelyn stood in the center of what was left of the house. Her breathing was uneven, and her body ached from every minute of the battle. It seemed the evil had gone, but its remnants still lingered in the air. The fire that had consumed the house hadn't touched the land. Only the ash remained, like a memory of what had happened. Evelyn ran her hand over her wrist, where a fresh scratch remained, the mark of what she'd set free. The screams from when she destroyed the knot of evil still echoed in her mind. She turned to leave, but her eyes caught something shiny in the ashes. She moved closer and saw a locket. It was old with intricate patterns, and in the center there was the same knot symbol. Her heart stopped. On one hand, she wanted to destroy it. On the other, she realized it might be the key to finally defeating the darkness. Evelyn decided to keep the locket. She slipped it into her pocket, knowing she needed to figure out what to do with it next. The road home was heavy. Her car still sat there, strangely untouched, in perfect condition. The sky above the forest was slowly lightening, but it didn't bring relief. Evelyn felt like an outsider in this world, one that kept moving forward as if nothing had happened. She knew it would be difficult to return to the town. What would she tell people? That the house inherited from her aunt was consumed by dark evil and she was the last survivor? It would sound like madness. Halfway to the city, a strange crackling noise came from her car. The radio, which she'd thought was broken, suddenly turned on. On a low frequency, a voice came through, barely audible through the static. "You can't leave. This is just the beginning." Evelyn slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. She turned off the radio, but the sound kept coming. She pulled the locket from her pocket, and it suddenly grew hot, as though it was burning in her hand. In panic, she threw it out the window, and the radio immediately fell silent. However, as she continued driving, her gaze kept drifting to the rear-view mirror. She was certain she saw shadows on the road behind her. They were following her, moving too quickly to be human. When she got home, Evelyn locked all the doors, drew the curtains, and sat down at the table with her aunt's diary. There were a few pages left that she hadn't read. She turned them over, feeling the weight settle back onto her shoulders. If you're reading this, it means the knot has been destroyed. But evil never disappears completely. It will find a way to return. The locket is the anchor that binds it to this world. You must get rid of it once and for all. Evelyn grabbed her head. She had just thrown the locket away, but now she realized it was a mistake. She looked out the window and saw a strange black cloud rising over the forest. It was moving toward her house, like a thick swarm of insects. She knew she had to act quickly. Evelyn packed an old backpack, grabbed the diary, matches, a flashlight, and anything else that might help. She went back to the spot where she'd thrown the locket and found it on the ground. When she picked it up, the air around her turned cold, and whispers filled her mind again. "We'll be back. You can't stop us." She knew where to go. The only place that could finally destroy the evil, the old chapel that Elizabeth had written about. The chapel was located at the edge of the forest, where purification rituals had been held in the 19th century. Evelyn had never been there, but she felt this was her last chance. The road to the chapel felt like a journey into another dimension. The forest was dark and dense, sounds vanished, as if the world around her had frozen. Finally, she saw the old building. It was partially destroyed, but still imposing. A rusty cross hung on the door, and inside there was the smell of antiquity and wax. Evelyn lit the candles on the altar and placed the locket in the center. She found a spell in the diary that was supposed to sever the last connection of evil to this world. The voices grew louder, and the walls of the chapel trembled, but she kept reading, pouring all her strength into each word. When she finished, the locket burst into bright light. Evelyn shut her eyes, feeling a wave of warmth and light pierce through her. The voices faded, and there was a deafening silence. At dawn, Evelyn left the chapel. She looked back at the forest, which no longer seemed so hostile. Now she felt free, but she understood that this experience had changed her forever. Evelyn returned to her home and sat by the window with a cup of coffee. She watched the quiet street, feeling the world return to its familiar rhythm. But deep down, she knew that evil never fully disappears. It waits, watches, searching for a new way to enter this world. And yet, she smiled. She had survived, and if it came to it, she would fight again.